Imagine a city so grand, so wealthy, and so powerful that for over 1,000 years, it was called the center of the world. Curious, this was Constantinople. Today we know it as Istanbul, but in the year 1453, it was the last standing piece of the ancient Roman Empire. While the rest of Europe was struggling through the dark and messy Middle Ages, Constantinople was a city of gold, marble, and massive libraries. Thoughtful, it sat exactly where Europe meets Asia, acting as a giant bridge for trade. If you wanted silk from China or spices from India, the path led straight through the gates of this legendary city. Before we witness the final collision between two of history's greatest empires, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We are uncovering the stories of the world's most epic battles, and you won't want to miss the moment the world changed forever. Your support helps us keep these deep dives into history alive. Welcome to War Before Law, and this is the story of the city that refused to die. To understand why this city was so special, you have to realize that it wasn't just a place, it was a symbol. Thoughtful, for the Christians of Europe, Constantinople was the ultimate fortress of their faith. At its heart stood the Hagia Sophia, a church so massive and beautiful that people said its golden dome looked like it was hanging from the sky by a silver chain. Inside, the walls were covered in sparkling mosaics, and the air was thick with the scent of incense. It was the largest building in the world for centuries, a place where emperors were crowned and where the people believed God himself protected the city. But by the year 1453, the glory was fading. The once mighty Byzantine Empire, which used to rule over dozens of countries, had shrunk. It was like a giant tree that had rotted away until only the trunk was left. The empire was now basically just the city itself and a few small patches of land nearby. It was a ghost of its former self. The population had dropped from nearly 1 million people to only about 50,000. Many of the great palaces were falling apart, and some of the parks were being used to grow vegetables because the city was so isolated. Outside the city gates, the world was changing rapidly. A new power was rising, the Ottoman Turks. They were young, motivated, and they had conquered almost everything around the city. Constantinople was now like a tiny Christian island sitting in the middle of a massive Ottoman ocean. Size. The Ottoman sultans had tried to take the city many times before, but they had always failed. To them, Constantinople was the red apple, the ultimate prize that would prove they were the new masters of the world. The man sitting on the throne inside the city was Emperor Constantine XI. He was a brave and honest leader, but he knew he was in a desperate situation. Concerned, he looked out from his palace and saw Ottoman forts being built just a few miles away. He knew that the war before law was coming to his doorstep. He sent desperate letters to the Pope and the kings of Europe, begging for soldiers, ships, and food. He told them that if Constantinople fell, the door to Europe would be kicked wide open. But Europe was busy. The kings were fighting their own wars and arguing over religion. Only a few hundred brave volunteers from Italy and a small group of Greek soldiers answered the call. Size. When the final count was made, Constantine realized he only had about 7,000 men to defend a city with 14 miles of walls. Outside, the Ottoman army was gathering, and their numbers were terrifying. Over 80,000 soldiers were marching toward the city, bringing with them a weapon the world had never seen before. Why did everyone think Constantinople was safe? It was because of the Theodosian Walls. For over 1,000 years, these walls had been the ultimate defense. They weren't just one wall. They were a triple layer of stone and brick, fronted by a deep moat filled with water. No army in history had ever managed to break through them. They had survived earthquakes, massive catapults, and hundreds of attacks. The people inside the city believed that as long as the walls stood, the Roman Empire would live forever. However, the Romans were living in the past, and the Ottomans were looking at the future. The Ottomans were bringing gunpowder. They weren't just coming with ladders and swords. They were bringing giant cannons that could throw stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds. The era of stone walls was about to meet the era of heavy artillery. The city that refused to die was about to face a test that no amount of prayer or ancient stone could prepare it for. As the dust clouds from the approaching Ottoman army appeared on the horizon, the church bells of Constantinople began to ring. It was a sound of warning, but also a sound of defiance. The people gathered in the Hagia Sophia, praying for a miracle. They knew that a siege was coming that would decide the fate of their religion, their culture, and their lives. The young Sultan Mehmed II was coming to claim his prize, and Constantine XI was ready to die to protect it. The stage was set for the most famous siege in history. It was Old World versus New World, cross versus crescent, and stone versus gunpowder. The Queen of Cities was about to be surrounded, and the clock was ticking. In our next chapter, we will meet the man behind the attack, the young, brilliant, and obsessed Sultan Mehmed II, who risked everything to capture the city that refused to die. While the people inside Constantinople were praying for a miracle, across the water, a young man was planning their destruction. His name was Mehmed II, and in 1453, he was only 21 years old. To the kings of Europe, he was just a boy, an inexperienced leader they thought they could easily ignore or trick. But Mehmed wasn't interested in being a normal sultan. From the moment he took the throne, he had only one thought that filled his mind every day and every night: Constantinople. Before we look into the brilliant and terrifying mind of the man who changed history, make sure you are still following along and subscribed. We are peeling back the layers of the world's most famous siege, and you won't want to miss how this young leader did the impossible. This is war before law, and the hunt for the red apple has begun. Mehmed wasn't like his father. His father had tried to take the city and failed, eventually signing treaties to keep the peace. When Mehmed took over, the Roman Emperor Constantine thought he could bully the young sultan. Constantine sent a message demanding more money, threatening to release a rival prince if Mehmed didn't pay up. It was a massive mistake. Instead of being scared, Mehmed used this as the perfect excuse to break the peace. He told his advisors, "The empire of the Romans is a city, and that city is a target." Mehmed was a true Renaissance man of the East. He spoke 6 languages, including Greek and Latin. He studied the lives of Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a scientist and an engineer. He knew that to take Constantinople, he couldn't use the old ways of war. He couldn't just wait for the people inside to starve, because the city could be supplied by sea. He couldn't just climb the walls, because the Roman defenders were too skilled. He needed something new. He needed power. To prove he was serious, Mehmed began building a massive fortress on the European side of the water, just a few miles from the city walls. He called it Rumuli Hazari, or the throat cutter. He put thousands of laborers to work, finishing the massive stone castle in just 4 months. This fortress allowed him to control the Bosphorus Strait. Any ship trying to bring food or help to Constantinople had to pass his cannons. When a Venetian ship tried to sail past without stopping, Mehmed's cannons sank it with a single shot. The message was clear: the city was being choked. But the walls of Constantinople were still the biggest problem. They were nearly 1,000 years old, but they were massive. They consisted of a moat, an outer wall, and a giant inner wall that was 40 feet high and 15 feet thick. Even the strongest catapults of the time would just bounce off them. Mehmed knew he needed a weapon that could crack stone like glass. This is where the story takes a strange turn. A master engineer named Orban arrived at Mehmed's court. Orban was actually from Hungary, and he had first gone to the Roman Emperor Constantine, offering to build him weapons. But the Romans were so poor they couldn't afford to pay him. Mehmed, however, had all the gold in the world. When Orban claimed he could build a cannon so powerful it could blast the walls of Babylon itself, Mehmed didn't just hire him. He gave him quadruple the pay and every resource he needed. For months, the sound of hammers and the heat of furnaces filled the Ottoman foundries. They were casting the basilica, a monster of a cannon. It was 27 feet long and weighed 20 tons. It could fire a stone ball weighing 1,500 pounds for over a mile. It took 60 oxen and 400 men just to move it. When it was finally tested, the sound was so loud it could be heard for 15 miles, and the stone ball buried itself 6 feet into the ground. Mehmed looked at the monster weapon and smiled. He finally had his wall breaker. Inside the city, the Romans watched in horror as the Ottoman army began to gather. The young sultan wasn't just bringing soldiers, he was bringing an industrial war machine. Mehmed was obsessed with every detail. He spent his nights drawing maps of the city's weak points. He didn't sleep, he didn't drink, and he didn't listen to the advisors who told him to be careful. He told his generals, "Either I take this city, or the city takes me. Mehmed was also a master of psychological war. He gathered an army of over 80,000 men, the Janissaries, his elite professional soldiers, the cavalry, and thousands of volunteers from all over the Islamic world. He lined them up in perfect rows outside the city walls, their colorful flags waving in the wind and their drums beating a constant, terrifying rhythm. To the 7,000 defenders standing on top of the walls, it looked like a sea of humans that stretched all the way to the horizon. On April 6, 1453, the young sultan gave the order. The basilica was loaded with gunpowder and a massive stone ball. The fuse was lit. A massive explosion rocked the earth, and a cloud of black smoke filled the air. The stone ball slammed into the ancient walls of Theodosius with the force of a falling mountain. For the first time in 1,000 years, the unbreakable walls began to crumble. The city that refused to die was officially under siege. The young sultan had arrived, and he had brought the future of warfare with him. The war before law had begun, and the ancient world was about to be smashed by the power of gunpowder. To understand why the world thought Constantinople could never fall, you have to look at the Theodosian Walls. For over 1,000 years, these weren't just a boundary. They were the most advanced defensive system ever created by human beings. They were the reason the Roman Empire had survived while every other ancient kingdom had crumbled into dust. To any army standing outside, looking up at the gray stone and the massive towers, the message was clear: go home. You cannot get in. Before we explore the secrets of the stone and the blood that soaked into these foundations, remember to stay subscribed. We are halfway through the War Before Law documentary, and the stakes are about to get much higher. The ancient world is about to meet the modern world, and the collision will be deafening. The walls were named after Emperor Theodosius II, who built them in the 5th century. They weren't just one single wall, but a triple-layered trap designed to kill anyone who tried to cross. If you were an Ottoman soldier attacking the city, your nightmare started long before you even touched the stone. First, you had to cross a moat. This wasn't just a ditch. It was 60 feet wide and 20 feet deep, often filled with water. As you tried to swim or build a bridge, Roman archers and catapults would rain fire down on you from above. If you somehow survived the moat, you reached a low wall called the breastwork. Behind that was the first real obstacle, the outer wall. It was 25 feet high and topped with battlements where soldiers waited with spears and stones. But even if you managed to climb that, the worst was yet to come. Rising up behind the outer wall was the massive inner wall. This was the giant. It stood 40 feet tall and was 15 feet thick, solid stone and mortar that had survived massive earthquakes and centuries of war. It was lined with 96 massive towers, each one a fortress in itself, positioned so that the defenders could shoot at you from every single angle. There was no blind spot. If you were in the space between the walls, you were in a killing zone. For 1,000 years, the unbreakable walls had done their job. The Huns had turned away in fear. The Persians had failed. The Arabs had spent years outside these gates and eventually gave up. The walls were more than stone. They were a psychological barrier. The people of Constantinople believed the walls were divinely protected. They walked the ramparts with icons of the Virgin Mary, convinced that no human force could ever break through. But in 1453, Sultan Mehmed II brought something the builders of the 5th century never imagined: gunpowder. When the giant basilica cannon fired its first shot, the sound was like the end of the world. The stone ball, weighing as much as a small car, smashed into the outer wall. The Romans on top felt the ground shake beneath their feet. For the first time in history, the stone didn't just hold, it cracked. Dust and debris filled the air. The Ottoman soldiers cheered, thinking the city was already theirs. But the Romans were not just waiting to die. They were masters of siege defense. Every night, while the Ottoman cannons cooled down, the people of the city, men, women, and children, rushed to the gaps in the walls. They didn't have fresh stone or professional masons, so they used whatever they could find. They stuffed the holes with barrels of earth, old furniture, and soft materials like wool and hay. Surprisingly, this garbage defense worked better than the stone itself. When the cannons fired again the next day, the stone balls would hit the soft earth and wool and get stuck, instead of shattering the hard stone. The war before law had turned into a race against time. The Ottomans would spend all day knocking the wall down, and the Romans would spend all night building it back up. Mehmed was frustrated. Size, he had the biggest cannons in the world, but the city that refused to die was still standing. He began to realize that the walls weren't just a physical object, they were the city's heart. As long as the defenders had hope, the walls would never truly fall. Determined, he decided to increase the pressure. He ordered his smaller cannons to fire in a triangulation pattern, hitting 2 spots near each other and then a 3rd spot in the middle to bring down a whole section of the wall at once. The heat was intense. The basilica cannon grew so hot that it started to crack. Orban, the master engineer, had to pour warm oil over the metal to keep it from exploding. Every shot took hours to prepare. The defenders used this time to mock the Ottomans from the top of the walls, waving their banners and shouting defiance. But Constantine XI, the emperor, knew the truth. Every shot from the cannons was weakening the foundation. The walls were like an old man's teeth, looking strong on the outside, but loosening with every blow. Inside the city, food was running low. The wine was disappearing. The people were tired. They watched the Ottoman campfires at night, a sea of lights that seemed to never end. They knew that sooner or later, a gap would open that they couldn't plug with barrels and dirt. The unbreakable walls were finally meeting their match. But the walls weren't the only way into the city. Constantinople was a triangle, surrounded by water on 2 sides. One side was the Sea of Marmara, where the currents were too strong for an easy attack. The other was the Golden Horn, a calm harbor protected by a massive iron chain that stretched across the water, blocking any ship from entering. Mehmed knew that if he could get his navy into that harbor, the Romans would have to move their few soldiers away from the land walls to protect the sea walls. The siege was about to move from the land to the water, and the young Sultan was about to perform a miracle of engineering that would haunt the Romans' nightmares forever. The walls were holding, for now, but the red apple was starting to bruise. The air around Constantinople was no longer filled with the smell of the sea. It was thick with the sulfurous sting of black powder. Sultan Mehmed II knew that the walls were strong, but he also knew that every stone has a breaking point. To find that point, he turned to the most terrifying weapon of the 15th century, the basilica. This wasn't just a gun, it was a masterpiece of destruction, a bronze monster that changed the war before law into a war of industrial power. Before we witness the earth-shaking thunder of the world's first superweapon, make sure you stay subscribed. We are moving into the heart of the siege, where the ancient world's defenses meet the future's fire. Your support keeps these stories of epic struggle alive. This is the moment the Queen of Cities felt the ground tremble like never before. The creation of the basilica was a feat of engineering that seemed like dark magic to the people of the time. The master engineer Orban had spent months in the Ottoman foundries, melting down massive amounts of copper and tin. The mold was buried deep in the earth to handle the pressure of the cooling metal. When the bronze finally hardened, the result was a tube 27 feet long with walls 8 inches thick. It was designed to do one thing: throw a 1,500-pound stone ball with enough force to shatter walls that had stood for a millennium. Moving this beast to the front lines was a war in itself. It took 60 oxen, yoked together in pairs, and a team of 400 men to pull the wooden carriage. A special crew of 200 builders marched ahead of the cannon, leveling hills and building sturdy wooden bridges over every stream. It took 2 full months to travel just 150 miles. When it finally arrived outside the St. Romanus Gate, the weakest point of the city's land walls, the Roman defenders watched from above in a silence of pure terror. The process of firing the basilica was a slow, rhythmic ritual. First, the crew had to load massive amounts of gunpowder into the chamber. Then, they shoved in the giant stone ball, carved perfectly round from granite. When the fuse was lit, the explosion was so powerful that it could be heard for miles, and the recoil sent the cannon flying back on its tracks. The smoke was so thick it hid the sun, and the vibration was so intense it was said to cause miscarriages in nearby villages. When the stone ball hit the Theodosian Walls, the impact was unlike anything the Romans had ever experienced. A catapult stone would dent the wall. The basilica's stone ball pulverized it. Huge chunks of masonry, some the size of small houses, were blasted into dust. The unbreakable walls were literally being turned into gravel. Mehmed's smaller cannons fired in between the basilica's shots, preventing the defenders from having a moment of peace. However, the basilica had a weakness: heat. The friction and the explosion of the gunpowder made the bronze barrel dangerously hot. After every shot, the crew had to soak the cannon in warm oil to prevent the metal from cracking under the stress. This meant the giant gun could only be fired 7 or 8 times a day. For the Romans inside, those long pauses were their only hope. During these breaks, the Emperor Constantine XI personally led the citizens into the gaps. They didn't try to rebuild with stone, there wasn't time. Instead, they used a soft defense. They filled wooden crates with earth and bushes, piled up sacks of wool, and even used old carpets and tapestries. This soft material was actually better at absorbing the shock of the cannonballs than the hard, brittle stone. When the next shot hit, it didn't shatter the wall. It just got buried in the dirt. Mehmed was furious. He was using the most advanced technology on Earth, but the city that refused to die was fighting back with dirt and blankets. He realized that the land walls might take months to fully collapse, and he didn't have months. The kings of Europe might finally wake up and send a fleet. He needed to open a second front. He needed to attack the Golden Horn, the city's northern harbor. The Golden Horn was protected by a massive iron chain, floating on wooden logs that stretched across the water. It blocked any Ottoman ship from entering the harbor. Mehmed's navy had tried to break the chain and failed. As long as the chain held, the Romans could keep all their soldiers on the land walls. Mehmed knew that if he could get his ships behind that chain, the Roman defenders would have to split their tiny force, making the land walls much easier to capture. One night, Mehmed sat in his tent, looking at the mountains that separated his fleet from the harbor. Most generals would see a mountain as a wall. Mehmed saw it as a road. He called his engineers and gave them an order that sounded insane. "We will not sail around the chain. We will go over the mountain." He ordered thousands of workers to build a wooden track over the steep hills of Galata. They used massive logs, smoothed them down, and coated them in thick layers of animal fat and grease. At the same time, his cannons kept up a deafening roar against the land walls to distract the Romans. Under the cover of darkness and the smoke of the monster cannon, the Ottoman army began to haul their ships, fully rigged and with crews on board, up the hills. Inside the city, the Romans heard the distant sound of chanting and the creaking of wood, but they assumed it was just the Ottoman camp preparing for another assault on the walls. They had no idea that the war before law was about to take a turn that defied the laws of nature. The young sultan was about to bypass 1,000 years of naval strategy by moving his navy across the land. As the basilica cooled for the night and the dust of the crumbling walls settled, the city of Constantinople remained defiant. But the miracle of the walls was about to be met with the miracle of the ships. The red apple was being squeezed from both sides, and the final storm was gathering. For weeks, the massive iron chain protecting the Golden Horn had been a wall that Sultan Mehmed II could not break. His navy had tried to ram it, and his sailors had tried to cut it, but the Roman ships behind the chain, taller and more experienced, had rained down fire and stones, sinking every Ottoman vessel that got too close. As long as that chain stayed in place, the northern side of Constantinople was safe. The Romans could keep almost all of their 7,000 soldiers on the land walls, facing the monster cannon. Before we witness one of the most insane engineering feats in the history of warfare, make sure you are subscribed. We are entering the impossible chapter of the siege, where a young leader proved that if you can't go through a door, you build a road over the roof. This is war before law, and the water is about to turn into a trap. Mehmed knew that if he could get his fleet into the Golden Horn, he would force the Emperor Constantine to pull soldiers away from the land walls to protect the harbor walls. But the mouth of the harbor was blocked by the chain and guarded by powerful Venetian and Genoese ships. Mehmed looked at the hills of Galata, steep, wooded, and rugged terrain that separated the Bosphorus Sea from the harbor. To any other general, this was a mountain. To Mehmed, it was a shortcut. He gave a secret order that seemed like a hallucination. "We will move the ships over the land." Thousands of workers were gathered. They didn't just clear a path. They built a sophisticated highway of wood. They laid down massive logs as rollers and constructed large wooden cradles to hold the hulls of the ships. To make the wood as slippery as ice, they slaughtered hundreds of cattle and sheep, using the animal fat and grease to coat the rollers until they glistened in the sun. While this was happening, Mehmed ordered his cannons to fire at the land walls with a fury the Romans had never seen. The noise was deafening, and the smoke was so thick it acted as a screen. The Romans were so focused on the crumbling stone in front of them that they didn't look behind them at the hills. On the night of April 22nd, the miracle began. Under the cover of darkness, Ottoman soldiers and laborers began to haul the ships out of the water. These weren't small rowboats. They were mid-sized galleys, fully rigged with sails and oars. Using massive teams of oxen and hundreds of men pulling on thick ropes, the ships began to climb the steep hills. It was a surreal sight. In the middle of the night, in the middle of a forest, ships were sailing over the earth. To keep the men motivated, Mehmed ordered the bands to play and the trumpets to sound. The sailors stayed on the decks, unfurling the sails as if they were at sea, while the oarsmen sat at their benches, moving their oars through the air in a rhythmic beat. They were rowing over the mountains. By the time the sun began to rise over Constantinople, 70 Ottoman ships had successfully crossed the 2 miles of land and slid silently into the waters of the Golden Horn. When the Roman sentries on the harbor walls looked out the next morning, they rubbed their eyes in disbelief. Yesterday, the harbor had been empty and safe. Today, an entire enemy fleet was sitting right under their noses, behind the unbreakable chain. The shock was psychological as much as it was military. The Romans felt that nature itself had been defeated by the Sultan. One chronicler wrote that it felt as if the world had been turned upside down. The Emperor Constantine XI now faced a nightmare. He had to take his already thin line of soldiers and stretch them even further. He had to take men away from the gaps in the land walls, where the basilica was still roaring, to guard the harbor walls. The red apple was now being squeezed from 3 sides: the land, the sea, and now the harbor. The Romans tried a desperate counterattack. A group of brave sailors volunteered to take a few ships and try to burn the Ottoman fleet in the middle of the night using Greek fire, the ancient world's version of napalm. But a spy in the city had already tipped off the Sultan. As the Roman ships crept through the dark water, Ottoman cannons opened fire from the shore. The Roman ships were blown apart, and the brave volunteers were executed in full view of the city walls. The war before law was reaching a fever pitch. Below the walls, a new kind of terror was beginning. Mehmed realized that if he couldn't go over the walls, and he couldn't just go through them, he would go under them. He brought in professional miners from the silver mines of Serbia. While the cannons thundered and the ships sat in the harbor, the earth beneath the city began to hollow out. The city that refused to die was now being attacked from the sky with cannons, from the sea with ships, and from the ground with tunnels. The ancient empire was running out of soldiers, running out of food, and running out of hope. Sighs, but the final storm was still weeks away, and the Romans had one last trick up their sleeves: a secret war in the dark. While the giant basilica cannon continued to roar above ground, a much quieter and more terrifying battle was beginning beneath the earth. Sultan Mehmed II was a man who tried every possible way to break a city, and he knew that stone walls, no matter how thick, all sat on the same thing: dirt. Curious, he realized that if he could dig underneath the Theodosian walls and blow up their foundations, the unbreakable walls would simply swallow themselves. The war before law was no longer just a clash of armies. It had become a secret war in the dark. Before we descend into the suffocating tunnels where men fought with pickaxes and gunpowder in total darkness, make sure you are still with us and subscribed. We are entering the hidden chapter of the siege, where the fate of an empire was decided by miners working in the mud. This is war before law, and the ground beneath Constantinople is about to scream. Mehmed brought in professional miners from the silver mines of Serbia, men who had spent their entire lives tunneling through solid rock. He gave them a simple mission: dig under the massive towers of the city and plant enough explosives or wooden supports to bring them down. Under the cover of the night and the constant noise of the cannon fire, these miners began to sink shafts into the earth. They worked in absolute silence, carrying out baskets of dirt by hand so the Roman sentries on the walls wouldn't hear them. But inside the city, the Romans had a secret weapon of their own: a man named Johannes Grant. He wasn't a soldier. He was a brilliant engineer from Germany or Scotland. History isn't quite sure which. He was a master of the earth. When he heard the faint, rhythmic thumping beneath the city streets, he knew exactly what was happening. He didn't panic. Instead, he placed large bowls of water and bells on the ground all along the inside of the walls. Whenever a bowl rippled or a bell gave a tiny ting, he knew the Ottomans were digging right underneath that spot. Johannes Grant began a counter-siege. He gathered a team of brave volunteers and started digging counter-tunnels. They weren't digging to get out. They were digging to find the enemy. Imagine this scene: a narrow, cramped tunnel just 4 feet high, lit only by a flickering candle, with the weight of the entire world pressing down on you. You dig until you hear the sound of another shovel hitting the dirt just inches away. Suddenly, the wall of dirt would collapse, and the two sides would come face to face in the pitch black. This wasn't a battle of swords and shields. It was a desperate, claustrophobic struggle with daggers, pickaxes, and bare hands. There was no room to swing a sword. Men strangled each other in the mud, fighting for every inch of oxygen. The Romans were incredibly successful in this underground war. When they found an Ottoman tunnel, they didn't just fight. They used Greek fire, a mysterious liquid that burned even on water and couldn't be put out. They would pump the liquid into the Ottoman tunnels and set it ablaze. The screams of the Ottoman miners would echo through the vents as they were burned alive in the very traps they had built. Sometimes, the Romans would flood the tunnels with water, drowning the enemy in the dark. Other times, they would simply collapse the tunnel, burying the miners forever. Johannes Grant and his men destroyed every single tunnel the Ottomans dug. One by one, the Serbian miners were defeated by the master of the earth. Mehmed was furious. His ships had moved over mountains. His cannons were cracking the stone, but his miners were being slaughtered in the mud. He realized that this city that refused to die was protected not just by stone, but by the brilliance of its defenders. But while the Romans were winning the war underground, they were losing the war of survival above. Inside the city, the food was almost gone. The people were eating boiled leather and weeds. The Emperor Constantine XI walked the streets every day, trying to keep the spirits of his people high. But he looked like a ghost. He hadn't slept in weeks. He knew that even if they destroyed every tunnel, the sheer numbers of the Ottoman army would eventually overwhelm them. A strange atmosphere began to settle over the city. There were rumors of ancient prophecies. People said that the city would only fall when the moon gave a sign. On May 22nd, a lunar eclipse occurred, and a blood-red moon hung over the Golden Horn. To the superstitious people of the Middle Ages, this was the ultimate omen of doom. Panic began to spread. Even the bravest soldiers started to look at the sky with fear. Mehmed saw the fear. He knew that the Romans were at their breaking point. He called a grand council of his generals and advisors. Some told him to give up, saying the city was cursed and the defense was too strong. But Mehmed's inner circle, led by his most loyal generals, told him to strike one last time. Mehmed stood up and told his army that the final assault was coming. He promised them 3 days of plunder. All the gold, the silver, and the treasures of the Queen of Cities would be theirs if they could just get over the walls. The Ottoman camp exploded in celebration. Thousands of campfires were lit, stretching for miles, until it looked like the stars had fallen to the earth. The soldiers began to chant and beat their drums, a sound so loud it shook the windows of the Hagia Sophia. Inside the city, the Romans watched the lights and heard the noise. They knew what it meant. The war before law was about to reach its final bloody climax. Before the storm broke, something beautiful happened. On the night of May 28th, the night before the final attack, the people of Constantinople did something they hadn't done in centuries. They stopped arguing about religion and politics. They gathered in the Hagia Sophia for one last mass. For a few hours, the city was peaceful. They were preparing their souls for what was coming. As the sun began to set on May 28th, 1453, a strange and heavy silence fell over the Ottoman camp. Sultan Mehmed II had ordered his men to rest and keep quiet. The roaring cannons that had shaken the earth for 7 weeks finally went silent. The thousands of drums stopped beating. The only sound was the distant lapping of the waves against the city walls. But inside Constantinople, the people knew this silence wasn't peace. It was the deep breath before the final scream. Before we enter the golden doors of the world's most beautiful church for its final night of prayer, make sure you stay subscribed. We are reaching the emotional heart of this story, the moment where 1,000 years of history prepared to face its end. This is war before law, and the Queen of Cities is saying her last goodbye. For centuries, the Christians of Constantinople had been divided. They argued over tiny details of religion, and the Greeks and Italians often hated each other more than they feared the enemy. But on this night, the war before law stopped at the church doors. The Emperor Constantine XI called for a grand procession. He invited everyone, Orthodox, Catholic, rich, and poor, to march together. They carried the most sacred icons of the city, walking along the crumbling walls and praying for the unbreakable walls to hold just one more time. As night fell, the entire population moved toward the Hagia Sophia. This was the spiritual heart of the Roman world. Imagine entering a building so massive that the dome above you seemed to disappear into the darkness. Thousands of candles flickered, reflecting off the gold mosaics of saints and emperors. For the first time in generations, the church was full. Italians stood next to Greeks. Soldiers stood next to children. They weren't fighting over theology anymore. They were a family facing a storm. The Emperor Constantine arrived, looking older than his 49 years. He moved through the crowd, asking for forgiveness from anyone he might have offended. It was a scene of heartbreaking humility. The last Roman emperor, a man whose title traced back to Augustus Caesar and Constantine the Great, was preparing his soul for death. He took the Holy Communion and then walked out of the golden doors, mounting his horse to ride back to the St. Romanus Gate, the spot where the Ottoman cannons had done the most damage. Outside the city, the silence was broken by a different kind of sound. Sultan Mehmed II was riding through his camp, speaking to his soldiers. He didn't talk about religion or politics. He talked about glory and gold. He reminded them that the city was filled with the accumulated wealth of 1,000 years. He promised them 3 days of total plunder. He told his elite janissaries that the man who first climbed the wall would be rewarded with lands and titles that would make him a king. The Ottoman camp began to hum with a low, vibrating energy. Men sharpened their swords by the light of their fires. They checked the straps on their shields and whispered their final prayers. Mehmed looked at the dark silhouette of the city and the high dome of the Hagia Sophia. He knew that by tomorrow night, either he would be praying inside that church, or he would be dead beneath its walls. Inside the city, the soldiers on the walls were doing the same. Johannes Grant, the master of the tunnels, checked the gaps one last time. The Italian commander, Giovanni Giustiniani, moved his men into position. These 7,000 defenders were exhausted. They were hungry, they were outnumbered 10-1, and they knew no help was coming from Europe. But they stood their ground. They looked out at the thousands of Ottoman campfires, a sea of lights that looked like the stars had fallen to the earth, and they waited. A thick mist began to roll in from the sea, wrapping the city in a gray shroud. Some said it was the Holy Spirit leaving the city. Others said it was a sign that the city that refused to die was finally being covered by a funeral veil. The bells of the churches began to toll one last time, a slow and steady ring that echoed through the empty streets. At 1:30 in the morning on May 29th, the silence was shattered forever. A massive shout rose from the Ottoman camp, a cry of Allah that was so loud it was heard across the water in Asia. Every single cannon in the Sultan's army fired at once. The final storm had begun. The young Sultan wasn't sending his men in waves. He was throwing everything he had at the walls at the same time. The first wave was the irregulars, untrained volunteers who were sent in simply to exhaust the defenders and fill the moats with their bodies. They rushed forward with ladders and torches, shouting, screaming, and clawing at the stone. The Romans rained down arrows, rocks, and boiling oil, but for every Ottoman who fell, 3 more took his place. The war before law had become a meat grinder. Sighs, as the dawn began to break, the sky turned a bruised purple. The ground was slick with blood, and the air was so thick with smoke you could barely breathe. The irregulars had failed, but they had done their job. The Roman defenders were tired. Their arms were heavy, and their swords were notched. That was the moment Mehmed had been waiting for. He looked at his elite janissaries, fresh, armored, and deadly, and pointed toward the crumbling St. Romanus Gate. The final hour of the Roman Empire was at hand. The stone was breaking, the ships were in the harbor, and the young sultan was ready to claim his crown. In our next chapter, we will witness the final storm, the moment the walls finally failed, and the legendary disappearance of the last emperor. On May 29, 1453, at 1:30 in the morning, the night sky over Constantinople didn't just turn bright, it exploded. Sultan Mehmed II had decided that the time for waiting was over. He didn't send his men in small groups. He threw his entire army at the walls in 3 massive waves. The war before law was no longer a chess match. It was a storm of human bodies, screaming metal, and the endless roar of the giant basilica cannon. Before we witness the final moments of an empire that lasted 1,000 years, make sure you are subscribed. We are at the climax of the story, the moment where the unbreakable walls finally met a force they couldn't stop. Your support helps us tell these stories of the world's most epic turning points. This is war before law, and the gates of history are being kicked open. The first wave was made up of the irregulars. These were tens of thousands of volunteer soldiers from all over the Ottoman world. They weren't highly trained, but they were filled with religious zeal and the promise of gold. They rushed the walls with thousands of wooden ladders, trying to swarm the defenders. The Romans, led by the Italian commander Giovanni Giustiniani, stood their ground. They rained down Greek fire, rocks, and arrows. The moat began to fill up, not with water, but with the bodies of the fallen. For 2 hours, the irregulars pushed, and for 2 hours, the 7,000 defenders pushed back. Mehmed watched from a nearby hill. He wasn't worried. He knew the irregulars wouldn't take the city, but he knew they would make the Romans tired. When the first wave finally broke and ran, Mehmed immediately sent in the second wave, the Anatolian Turks. These were professional, heavily armored soldiers. The fighting became even more intense. The sound of swords hitting shields was like 1,000,000 hammers hitting anvils. The air was so thick with the smell of blood and gunpowder that men were choking as they fought. Inside the city, the bells were ringing continuously, a frantic, high-pitched alarm that told the citizens the end was near. Women and children gathered in the churches, their eyes fixed on the doors, waiting for either a miracle or a disaster. The Emperor Constantine XI was everywhere at once. He rode his white horse along the ramparts, shouting encouragement to his men, his purple cloak stained with the dust of the crumbling walls. He was no longer a king. He was a soldier fighting for his home. Then, just as the sun began to peek over the horizon, Mehmed made his final move. He turned to his janissaries. These were his elite, unbeatable troops, men who had been trained since childhood for this exact moment. They marched toward the St. Romanus Gate in perfect silence, their white hats bobbing in the morning mist. As they reached the walls, the Ottoman band began to play a thunderous rhythm of drums and trumpets. A stroke of terrible luck hit the Romans. A small, hidden postern gate called the Kirkaporta had been left unlocked by accident after a small group of defenders had gone out for a raid. A few dozen Ottoman soldiers spotted the open door and rushed inside. They climbed to the top of the wall and raised the Ottoman flag. When the Roman defenders saw the enemy flag flying behind them, a cry of "The city is taken" echoed through the lines. Panic, the greatest enemy of any army, began to spread. At that exact moment, the brave Italian commander Giustiniani was hit by a piece of shrapnel from a cannon. He was badly wounded and had to be carried away to a ship in the harbor. When the soldiers saw their leader leaving, their hearts broke. The line snapped. The janissaries saw the opening and poured through the gaps in the walls like a flood. The Emperor Constantine XI saw that the day the walls fell had finally arrived. He knew there was no escape. According to legend, he turned to his few remaining friends and said, "The city is fallen, and I am still alive." He threw off his imperial crown, his purple cloak, and his golden boots so he wouldn't be recognized. He drew his sword and charged into the thickest part of the fighting near the gate. He was never seen again. No body was ever found. The last Roman emperor vanished into the smoke and the fire, becoming a legend that would haunt the city for centuries. The Ottoman soldiers flooded into the city. For the people of Constantinople, the nightmare they had feared for 50 days was now a reality. The soldiers moved toward the Hagia Sophia, where thousands of people were hiding behind the great bronze doors. The doors were smashed open with axes. The golden icons were torn down, the silk tapestries were shredded, and the treasures of 1,000 years were gathered into piles. But amidst the chaos, Sultan Mehmed II entered the city. He didn't come in a rage, he came in awe. He rode his horse slowly through the streets, looking at the ancient statues and the massive buildings. When he reached the Hagia Sophia, he dismounted and knelt, pouring a handful of dust over his turban as a sign of humility. He walked into the great church and ordered his imam to chant the call to prayer. The Queen of Cities had a new master. The cross was taken down and the crescent was raised. The fall of Constantinople was more than just the end of a siege. It was the end of the Middle Ages. The last living link to the world of the Caesars and the pharaohs had been severed. As the sun set on May 29, 1453, the map of the world was being redrawn. The city that refused to die had finally fallen, but in its death, it was about to give birth to a new era. As the sun set on May 29, 1453, the smoke from the monster cannon finally began to drift away into the Sea of Marmara. But the world that the sun had risen upon that morning was gone forever. The city that refused to die had finally changed hands, and with it, the Middle Ages came to a crashing, violent end. Sultan Mehmed II, now known as Mehmed the Conqueror, rode his horse through the blood-stained streets toward the Hagia Sophia. He was no longer just a young challenger. He was the master of the Queen of Cities and the leader of a new world superpower. Before we see how this one battle changed the map of the world and sparked the birth of the modern age, make sure you are subscribed. We have traveled from the first stone of the walls to the final scream of the empire. Your support allows us to bring these turning points of history to life. This is the final chapter of War Before Law, Constantinople. The scene inside the city was one of total transformation. For 3 days, as promised, the city was open to the Ottoman soldiers. Libraries filled with ancient Greek and Roman scrolls, knowledge that had been saved for 1,000 years, were scattered or sold. Golden altars were melted down, and the great bronze statues of the Caesars were toppled. But Mehmed was a man of vision. He didn't want to rule a graveyard. He wanted to rule a capital. He quickly ordered the destruction to stop. He wanted to rebuild Constantinople, now to be known as Istanbul, into the greatest city on earth. The impact of this fall hit Europe like a physical blow. When the news reached Rome and Venice, people wept in the streets. They couldn't believe the unbreakable walls had failed. The Pope called for a new crusade, but it was too late. The gateway to Europe was now wide open. The Ottoman Empire was no longer a regional power. It was a giant sitting at the crossroads of 3 continents. They controlled the Silk Road, the spice trade, and the holy sites. If a merchant in London or Paris wanted pepper or silk, they now had to pay taxes to the Sultan. This economic chokehold forced the Europeans to do something desperate. They couldn't go through the Middle East anymore, so they started looking for a way around it. Sailors in Portugal and Spain began to stare out at the Atlantic Ocean, wondering if they could reach India by sailing west. Just 40 years after the fall of Constantinople, a man named Christopher Columbus would set sail, leading to the discovery of the Americas. The fall of the old Rome in the east directly led to the birth of the New World in the west. But the fall did something else. It sparked a fire in the mind. As the city fell, hundreds of Greek scholars, artists, and scientists fled to Italy. They didn't bring gold, they brought books. They brought the original works of Plato, Aristotle, and the ancient Greek poets, knowledge that had been forgotten in Western Europe for centuries. This flight of the scholars acted like gasoline on the flickering fire of the Renaissance. Suddenly, Italy exploded with new art, new science, and a new way of thinking. The death of the Byzantine Empire was the spark that lit the flame of modern European culture. Inside the city walls, Mehmed began his own Renaissance. He invited people of all religions, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, to come and live in his new capital. He repaired the walls, rebuilt the markets, and turned the Hagia Sophia into a magnificent mosque, though he kept many of its beautiful features intact. Thoughtful, he saw himself as the new Caesar of Rome, merging the glory of the ancient world with the power of the Islamic world. The Ottoman Empire would go on to rule for nearly 500 more years, a shadow that stretched from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Egypt. Size. The War Before Law in 1453 taught the world a terrifying lesson. no wall is high enough, and no fortress is strong enough to stop the march of technology. The era of knights in shining armor and stone castles was over. Serious, the era of gunpowder, heavy artillery, and global empires had begun. The Basilica cannon had not just broken a wall, it had broken the old way of living. Today, if you walk along the old walls of Istanbul, you can still see the repairs made with different colored stones. You can see the dents where the Ottoman stone balls hit the Roman granite. You can stand in the spot where Constantine XI was last seen, or where Mehmed first entered the city. These stones tell a story of incredible bravery on both sides. They remind us that history isn't just about dates. It's about people who were willing to die for their faith, their home, and their future. Constantinople was the city that refused to die, and in a way, it never did. It simply evolved. It moved from one empire to another, from one faith to another, and from the ancient world to the modern one. The fall of 1453 was a tragedy for some and a triumph for others, but for the world, it was the moment the door to the future was finally unlocked. We hope this journey through the dust and fire of the Great Siege has helped you see how one city's struggle changed the fate of every person on Earth. History is a long chain, and the strongest link in that chain was forged on a bloody May morning in 1453.